Hi, I want to try to open up a story about Thanksgiving. This is part one of three videos that I'm going to be putting together about Thanksgiving this year. This year, 2021, is the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving. There were other Thanksgivings before that, and they didn't call it Thanksgiving, but that's a bit of a digression. What I want to talk to about today is about the possibility of telling a new story, a story of redemption, a new narrative for this event. And I think that this is an important thing for us to consider because I think that there's an overall problem. And I've made videos about what I think is the problem with the world, but I'm going to unpack it a little bit right now. So, one of the main concerns that I have is that we have a us them reality, and we also have the idea of good people and bad people. And we have good way of doing things, the bad way of doing things, and we have us and them, and this leads to a good guys and bad guys narrative. And anytime that we reduce someone to an image or a symbol or a word, there's something that's incredibly violent about that. And it's also a real challenge to really think that these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. And anytime we try to do that, it can be problematic, especially when we start mixing things up like the individual and the culture and the system. Yes, we have division about good and bad and us and them on all of those levels, but oftentimes we'll make mistakes. If I'm part of the bad group, am I a bad person? And so forth. Or is that person acting as an individual, or are they representative of their group? This can get pretty confusing. The other part of this problem is that these tend to be static labels. We tend to think that someone's done something bad, that they're bad, or someone's done something good, they're good. And we don't seem to have many paths for redemption in our culture. And I think that this applies to our politics, our criminal justice, just the way we even think about our systems. And that's a twofold problem. One, because the fact that it's static means that we can't change. But also, there's a way that we get dissuaded from being accountable for the harms that we've done. If we admit harm and then therefore become bad, then there's not really space for that. And that's the thing, is we really actually need to be able to face our harms and that we've done and that others have done from our past as a country and as a culture. We need to be able to reckon with our past so we can heal from it. Um, and also, if we're able to recognize our interdependence and mutual human dignity, then we can maybe make wise decisions about now and into the future. And that's something that's not working very well in our culture. So we'll talk a bit about how this shows up in Thanksgiving and then explain a new way of approaching this whole question here. In Thanksgiving, oftentimes this story of Thanksgiving is told in one or two ways. It's either a sugar-coated school pageant of coming together of pilgrims and Native Americans having a feast together, and in a certain way that has the ability to sort of wash over the following horrors of genocide. The other story that we might tell about Thanksgiving is to use it as an opportunity to highlight the incredible European genocide against Native peoples. Um, there's also concerns about impacts on climate and the environment and so forth. And when this happens, there's also a rejection of each other's stories. Sort of people either saying that this is all really just a story of horrors, or this is a story of coming together and family and gratitude, and then rejecting the other. One thing that I know from working in conflict is that conflict gets exacerbated when people want their own story to be heard so much that they stop listening to the other side. And I think that that's happening with Thanksgiving. Also, just other things we're doing with our Thanksgiving story is we're blurring some of the lines between the actual Plymouth colony and the Wampanoag people, their leaders, Massiot and Bradford. We can confuse these with the Pilgrim or the Puritans, which came later. We also confuse the Wampanoag with other native peoples. And oftentimes we can mix up the overall genocide of native peoples with individual actions. And individuals did things in that respect and others chose not to. Sort of clumping us all together gets this into a story about sort of white Europeans versus indigenous Native Americans. And when we mix that with the static state of good guys and bad guys, then we get things like the US is bad, or white people are bad, or indigenous folk are inherently victims. And when it gets static, we don't have a way of getting to the reconciliation, to the reckoning, and the healing that's necessary here. And also, when we get into this debate, we lose track of the nuance. And that itself becomes an impediment to our healing. Just to really capture just how challenging this question about Thanksgiving is, I'm going to read a quote from Lila June, who was a guest on my podcast, Fractal Friends. The real question we need to be asking this Thanksgiving, Lila June is an indigenous academic, or part indigenous, part European academic, speaker, music, songwriter, amazing human. So here's what she said. The real question we need to be asking this Thanksgiving season is, why is it so scary to face the truth of what we've done here? What are we gaining by pretending that it didn't happen? And that big question we don't expect anyone to be able to answer. Because if we were able to face these things, we wouldn't be where we are right now. It's just too hard to face it. People can't look the genocide in the face. It delegitimizes the whole story of the United States. And what happens if are we ready to lose this imaginary concept of the United States and the story behind it? But Thanksgiving is calling us to do that, to really understand that this whole encounter has been completely illegitimate, illegal, wrong, immoral, and ethical. Now, that's a lot to carry. And I still think it's worthwhile to work on focusing with Thanksgiving, because on the whole, the United States, the American people, and all peoples in certain ways, we have a lot to reckon with. We have to reckon with slavery and genocide of Native Americans, but then just colonialism and all the different wars and things that happened in the Cold War and conquest. Civil rights, we have plenty of things for us to reconcile with the drug war. So, Thanksgiving, in a certain way, is a useful bite-size, no pun intended there, sort of morsel for us to chew on and grapple with our history and see what it is we can learn from this. And so I think there's like kind of a twofold approach to answering the question of how do we find a redemptive narrative around Thanksgiving. So one, there's the need for creating space for just real reckoning and repair. And the other one is for us to kind of find a new story, a new way of telling the story. So reckoning and repair, what does that mean? Well, this was the topic recently of an event with the Thrive Network, which is doing a beloved community journey. And you can find the link over here for that. But I got to hear Lila June and Kazu Haga talk about reckoning and repair. And so I'll say that some of this is inspired by them. So, reckoning with our harm. Well, first of all, Thanksgiving is this perfect moment for us to face our history with open eyes and hearts. That, in a certain way, is what's the invitation of this holiday. And so my question is can we look at this with a certain amount of balance of compassion and criticism? Can we be grateful for all that came before us while also having our grievances about how things were done? Can we use this as a chance to just really reflect on how badly things went? And I think it's also worth saying that despite this like sweet encounter that actually did happen between the Wampanoag and the English separatists that we now call pilgrims, there was actually a legitimate gathering of people there that happened in the middle of a history afterwards of horrible genocide and destruction, but also in Europe, tons of pain and history that came before this. And somehow in the middle of this, some moment happened. And so how can we reckon with the whole bigger picture while also seeing this as something that's powerful and perhaps a symbol for the kind of repair that we want to make? But it's worth remembering that we can't just skip to the repair and the healing. The only way to get through healing is to go through facing of the harm that we've done. Forgiveness can only be done in the face of harm. Forgiveness can't be done if something bad hasn't happened. So if in order to repair, we have to recognize what's bad. Another way of seeing this, because I think that there's something interesting related to the criminal justice system in this. There's a quote here from the Houses of Healing, which is a book for prisoners who are trying to find out how to heal while in prison after doing things. And it has a quote in it that I think is great. Facing one's guilt, shame, and the actual impact of the abuse and the crime on one's victims can be extremely difficult and painful. But confronting these issues is a necessary prerequisite for any healing and self-forgiveness. So there's two pieces I want to pull out from this. First of all, we cannot heal until we face the harm. And while that may be hard, that is something that each of us need to do. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. None of us want to face harms that we've done. I don't want to face the harms that I've done. And also the harms of our ancestors and the harms that are continuing to happen on our behalf as a country. That's not easy to look at. Yet, it's a prerequisite for the re-healing and for that self-forgiveness. So healing has to happen with others, and this is where we can think about reparations and accountability and to offer the gift of healing to others. And it takes a lot of listening to do that. But also, there's a space here for our own self-forgiveness and our own self-acceptance. And that is true as a country and as individuals. Now, it seems strange that I would want to talk about forgiveness and healing of the perpetrators of harm. But what I can say is that we really can't offer anything to another person in the sense of healing or forgiveness until we've figured out how to do that in ourselves. So we're going to have to look at the hard things that come out of our past. Kazu Haga, in this recent thing, who's also a guest on my podcast, but at this Thrive event, offered this way of connecting with our ancestors. To my ancestors, I love you. I know that you have experienced harm, and I know that you have done incredible harm. I forgive you, ancestors, and I am contributing to making the repairs right now on your behalf. Engaging in the acts of healing and reparation is my gift to you, my ancestors, and all of you who came before. This is our gift, and I think this is really important for us to think about. How can we now contribute to the healing of the past? And in order to do that, we have to find a new way of thinking about harm. There's a idea that the conflict is the spirit of a relationship wanting to heal itself, to wanting to deepen. And when people feel like they don't belong, that's when they act out. So when we're thinking about how to engage in the process of healing and accountability and so forth, what would it look like if we could have accountability and healing and reckoning, that didn't mean that someone was going to be cast away. What would it mean if we all knew that accountability was a path to deeper connection and healing? What if it meant that we would belong more if we were able to get in closer to each other? Well, I think that could be very powerful, because honestly, there is an incredible amount of healing that we all have to do, and then we all are going to have to be involved in that. In order to do that, we have to believe that there's a path to redemption and repair and healing. And if it's not there, we have to offer that. Show people what is the path to redemption, repair, and healing. This is the time where we really need to lean into each other. We need to lean into ourselves. And it's time to atone and to embrace others who find the courage to atone for their wrongs. And so to get here, I think that we are due for a new kind of story. We know that stories have protagonists and antagonists, and they have a conflict, and they overcome something. But so often, this kind of story has the good guys and the bad guys. So what would it look like for us to build a different kind of story? This story would have various elements. It would acknowledge the complexity of being humans in a world full of mystery. And it would honor the fact that life is complex, that it's not always clear what is good and what is bad, that we are all playing out a tragic comic story that has its ups and its downs. We don't know if there's going to be a good ending. We're enacting the story now. Another aspect of a good story, a new kind of story, would look beyond the us and them, or beyond the antagonist and the protagonist. What would it look like to tell stories that had nuanced characters like you and me? What would it look like to tell stories where the reader or the listener or the speaker can identify with all the different characters in the story? To imagine what it would be like to be approached, to imagine what it would be like to approach another. We need to have a story like this that goes beyond the antagonist and the protagonist, because the real story is that we're interdependent, and we're interdependent because we exist. We're all here. And so any good story is going to have to help. Another thing that I would like to see in telling the story of Thanksgiving, but just in general, would be for us to sort of widen our perspective. And I mean this in two different ways. It's really important, getting beyond the us and them, to expand their perspective to include various cultures and peoples and perspectives and languages and modes of experiencing the world. But we also can widen the perspective by expanding the time window. That can allow us to notice where we are now in relation to the story, where people were in that moment in relation to the story, and the time that came before us. What were the conditions that were there? Something that's worth, remembering is that all of us, every human on this planet, is carrying the trauma of being forcibly removed from their indigenous roots. We all have ties to the land. We all are healers. This is, again, something that Lila June has taught me about, and all of our ancestors are healers, and we're all connected to the land. And at some point, our ancestors all experienced the trauma of being forcibly removed from their land and their culture and their language. And so I think another thing I would like to see in a better story is to put an emphasis on learning the lessons of the story, for it to be an allegory or a parable, something that teaches us. What is it like to tell a story that actually prompts a discussion, that creates an opportunity for us to talk about what happened and how we can change things, to actually give us an idea that we want to keep doing this in order to heal the story. This is how we're going to move forward. Because the truth is, when it comes to this globalization experience of cultures coming together across all of our differences, across continents, this story is still happening. It's still relevant. And the lessons that we can learn from these past stories are the lessons that we can now learn for us going forward. So here's what I got coming next for you in a couple days, because I want to keep on talking about the story. So tomorrow I'm going to be sharing a story of the deep history of Thanksgiving and see if we can find the nuance of the story and go beyond the us and the them aspect of it. And then the next day, I'm going to share 3 reasons to celebrate Thanksgiving, 3 traditional and respectful reasons to celebrate Thanksgiving. And if you don't want to celebrate Thanksgiving, then you can think of them as 3 ways to celebrate Thanksgiving or 3 things to consider as other people are celebrating Thanksgiving. So that's coming soon. And I just to close here, I want all of us to remember that whoever we are, whoever our ancestors were, we are all reckoning with the mistakes that of those who came before us. Whether they're our direct ancestors or not, we're dealing with some serious challenges, and none of us are removed from this. And Bayo Komolafe, who also I heard at a Thrive event, said this quote just a couple days ago. But I think this is where the transformation happens. When we learn to touch our wounds, we can touch our wounds and then we can recognize that we are all incomplete. Bayo offers that we need to lean in to the aesthetics of incompleteness. What does it mean for our country, for ourselves, for our families, for our land, to be an incomplete story? We still get to telling it. I think this is important because this great cultural encounter, whether we see it as just Europeans or Native Americans or just the global unity, coming together, globalization journey that we're all in, this story is still happening. So we get to ask some questions. I get to ask, what kind of guest do I want to be on this land? Someone who's far away from my roots. Who do you want to be as a guest on the land that you're on? And if you're actually not a guest on the land that you are, how do you want to be a host? Yeah, what is the etiquette of this experience? I think that we've all been stuck in this cycle of trauma, and we know that hurt people. But as another former guest of my podcast said, Alexa Garcia, healed people heal people. And so we need to break this cycle of trauma, to stop the cycle of hurt. But also we need to create space for healing. And I think one of the ways to do that is to heal yourself, for me to heal myself, to work on healing the family, work on healing the community, and our country. I think that it's important for us to see how we can find forgiveness as we're as we're creating accountability, for us to find mercy as we seek justice. Forgiveness and mercy are not just a gift to our ancestors. It's not just a gift to the other people who we are forgiving. Justice or forgiveness and mercy are a gift to ourselves. And as a gift to ourselves, our own healing then will allow us to effectively and earnestly engage in the collective healing of others and all of us as a whole. So please stay tuned. You can follow me on Substack or on YouTube or here on Facebook or other places. But thank you for listening to this video and for being willing to consider maybe there's a nuanced version of this story that will allow space for us to heal and grow. Thank you.